Hey everybody, Mr. J here. You can stop holding your breath because I know you've been waiting for this lecture for a long time because today we're going over the respiratory system. I'm going to go over the goals of the respiratory system, why it's important, what it does, as well as talk about 3 laws and effects that allow for proper functioning of the respiratory system. So sit in your seat, hang tight, you're going to learn a lot from this. So here we go. Respiratory system, the goals of the respiratory system. Respiratory means to breathe, right? So we are going to be bringing in oxygen as we inspire, as we breathe in, and we're going to expel carbon dioxide. We know that. We've learned that from a very young age, but why do we have to do it? We're going to dig in. And then we're also going to talk about how we regulate our blood acidity or our blood pH with this system as well. So let's step back. Why do we have to bring in oxygen in the first place? Well, your cells need energy, and you have 30 trillion cells in your body, all needing energy. So we got to feed them, right? Well, we feed them by eating, first off. So we get glucose, which is C6H12O6. This is glucose. When you eat food, you break it down into its bare carbohydrates, essentially. You break it down into glucose. Well, glucose combines with, you guessed it, oxygen at your body tissues. So glucose and oxygen come together specifically in your mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, right? It's generating energy. And this chemical reaction occurs, the cell respiration equation occurs, and we will make 6 water molecules, which they don't really bother us all that much. We will make 6 carbon dioxide molecules. That can bother us because that's an acid, okay? It can dissolve into an acid so it can make our blood really acidic. And it's a toxic waste product, essentially, of cell respiration. So we've got to get that guy out, and we'll come back to that. But the goal of cell respiration is not to produce carbon dioxide or water, it's to make a massive amount of ATP molecules. If you watch my ATP video, it talks about why this is such an important molecule for the cell, because we basically cleave the last phosphate off many times a day, every second, to make your body run properly. So this is the currency of energy for all of your cells. So we need to make ATP. Therefore, we respire, we breathe in oxygen, we eat, we get glucose from our food, and we produce these 3 things to make ATP. That was the goal. But I said we have to get rid of carbon dioxide. Now that is our goal after these things occur at your cells. Okay? So stay with me. I'm going to move this screen a little bit so you can see a little more. I'm going to move this to the side. Bingo. So now we're going to focus in on how your body actually brings in oxygen and how it expels CO2. But in order to do that, we need to learn a very important law called Dalton's Law. Dalton's Law is a physics equation essentially, but I promise it's very easy because it says that the total pressure that's pushing down from air, so for example, there's air pressure on me right now, is the sum of all of the different gases, so oxygen, argon, nitrogen, it's the sum of all those gases' individual pressures all come together to make the total pressure. So, in the atmosphere that we live in on Earth, our P net, so the atmospheric pressure pushing down on us, is 760 millimeters of mercury. So, how do we get this number? Well, we add up all of the gases in the atmosphere and their individual pressures on us, and we get the following numbers approximately. Nitrogen is the biggest with 560 millimeters of mercury. We don't really deal with nitrogen. Oxygen is around 150, give or take, millimeters of mercury, so very high. There's a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere. It's about 20% of the total atmosphere. And then carbon dioxide, we're also going to look at, has 0.2 millimeters of mercury, very low, and we don't really care about argon, so I'm just skipping that. Notice the different pressures. So if I were to say this simply, there's more pressure pushing down on you from oxygen as there is pressure pushing down on you of carbon dioxide. And this is very important in your lungs. So walk with me through this diagram. Up here is where your lungs are. Okay? The terminal end of your lungs turns into what's called the alveoli, which is a small little gas sac. It's made of simple squamous epithelial tissue, along with your capillaries, your pulmonary capillaries. They're very thin, so it allows for diffusion across the membrane. So I drew these 2 lines here, the black line and the blue line. the red line and black line, all of those are very thin cells that allow things to pass through very easily. So we don't even have to consider that. What you notice is in the alveoli, you notice some partial pressures. So when I say PO2 or PCO2, it's just referring to the amount of pressure pushing down from individual gases. In the alveoli, like during breathing, so you're breathing in, the partial pressure of oxygen is about 104. Whereas in your venous system, so your pulmonary artery is coming to it's pulmonary artery coming to the lungs to basically get oxygen, you can notice that the partial pressure of oxygen in your pulmonary artery, in your capillaries, is 40. It's quite low, okay? Then with carbon dioxide, you see that there's more carbon dioxide pressure coming from your blood vessels themselves, and there's lower in the alveoli. Things in nature like to flow from high to low concentration. Same thing with pressure. They like to flow from high to low pressure. So if we look at the oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen is higher here, lower here, so oxygen is going to flow into the capillaries. Whereas the carbon dioxide partial pressure inside the system versus the alveoli is higher here, lower here, so it's going to flow into the alveoli and out into the air, breathing out through your lungs, right? So if we look, once this has occurred, now the pressures are balanced. We've just had diffusion, so now there's no total movement in or out for either carbon dioxide or oxygen. But you notice how the values change. So oxygen, the partial pressure in the blood, went from 40 to now 104. That's massive. We just saturated our blood with oxygen. And we also decreased the amount of carbon dioxide we had in our blood, which is a good thing too, because we're trying to get rid of it. It's a waste product, right? So now let's follow it through the systemic circulation. So now it goes to your left atria, through your mitral valve, to your left ventricle. Now it's pumped into the body to feed your body's tissues. Okay? So it gets to your body's tissues. And again, let me pause. The body needs oxygen, right, to combine with glucose to make ATP. So that's the reason we need to get a lot of oxygen to this area. So now we're at our body tissues. The blood is feeding it. The partial pressure of oxygen, as you can see, is higher in the blood and lower at the tissues because the tissues are using up all the oxygen, right, for cell respiration. So it's going to be very low here. So we move down our gradient, and oxygen is going to flow into the body tissues. Now, look at carbon dioxide. Since the cells are making a lot of carbon dioxide from cell respiration, they're going to have higher partial pressures of carbon dioxide. As you can see, the gradient flows this direction. So now we're pushing carbon dioxide back into the blood until that happens, and then they balance out. So now there's no net movement. So once that happens, the partial pressures are the same. And as you notice, we have a lot of carbon dioxide in the blood, and we have very low amounts of oxygen because we just dropped them all off at the tissues. So where do we have to go? Back to the lungs, and now we get our oxygen back, and it cycles through and through and through. So that is how partial pressures work within the respiratory system. However, what if, for example, this is morbid, you get buried alive? If you get buried alive, the pressure of carbon dioxide in your little box or whatever they buried you in is going to increase and increase and increase. And your oxygen, as you're using it in your tissues, is going to decrease and decrease and decrease, right? So now the pressure gradients will be all off, right? So now oxygen won't be able to flow in because there's no pressure gradient. And carbon dioxide is going to build up, so carbon dioxide is going to make its way back into the bloodstream if it were so high. And so that's why you suffocate. Very bad, so I don't recommend that. Now, another effect that we need to talk about is the Haldane effect, and we're also going to talk about the Bohr effect very briefly. What the Haldane effect says is that the more oxygen is bound to hemoglobin, so this HB is hemoglobin, and this is found on your blood cells. So you basically see this. So you have your blood cell, and there's going to be these little protein arms, and those protein arms can bind two things in this case. It can bind either oxygen or it can bond CO2. Okay, it just helps, it's the carrier, right? So the blood cell is this little plate, it carries carbon dioxide and oxygen in its hemoglobin protein. Well, the Haldane effect, they realized that the more oxygen gets bound to it, the less carbon dioxide bonds to it. That's interesting, right? So basically, I'm saying if there's oxygen present, it's going to basically kick out the carbon dioxide. So now it's going to be saturated with oxygen. On the flip side, the more carbon dioxide is bound to hemoglobin, the less oxygen will be. So for example, say we get a carbon dioxide on here. So say CO2 comes in. Well, now it's going to kick out the oxygen. So now it's going to become saturated with carbon dioxide. So the hemoglobin can basically hold on to either one, but it's always pushed really far one way. So if some oxygen is going to be bound, it's going to bound a lot of oxygen, not much CO2 at all. But if there's more CO2, it's going to bond all CO2, but no oxygen. Why is that important? Well, think about it. If we look here, right? If we look here, we are dropping off oxygen in the tissues, right? As we drop off oxygen, there's going to be more carbon dioxide flowing in, right? So in this case, right here at the body tissues, there's going to be a ton of carbon dioxide that are popping onto the hemoglobin and kicking out the oxygen, right? But then when we get back here, as carbon dioxide gets pushed out, right? So in this section, now oxygen's moving in. So now all the carbon dioxides are going to get kicked out, and all of them are going to be replaced with oxygen, so that we can saturate our hemoglobin with oxygen to go back to the body tissues. So it basically says that the hemoglobin likes to be one way or another. Either wants a lot of oxygen or it wants a lot of carbon dioxide. Okay, so it's polarizing in that way. So that's one effect that we see. The other effect that's very beneficial is the Bohr effect. If you look online for the Bohr effect, you will likely see a graph or like a diagram, and I just don't think it shows the reality of it as well. I think it's beneficial if you know what you're looking at, but it's kind of difficult. So let me put it in layman's terms quick. The Bohr effect, B-O-H-R, like Bohr paint, the Bohr effect states that the more acidic, so basically the lower the pH, because the lower the pH is, the more acidic the blood, the more it will drop, it being hemoglobin, will drop off oxygen. Okay? So basically I'm saying if it's a really acidic blood, oxygen is going to get kicked out of the hemoglobin very quickly. So let's pause there actually. So if that's true, therefore the more acidic areas will kick out oxygen. Okay, well where's the acid come from? I'll tell you. Carbon dioxide, when you combine carbon dioxide with water in your blood, it makes what's called carbonic acid. This is carbonic acid. Carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen ions and its conjugate base, bicarbonate. The definition of an acid is that it releases hydrogen ions into a solution. So therefore, the more carbon dioxide there is, the more hydrogen ions there will be. Therefore, the more acidic. So let me ask you a question. Where in this diagram is the blood more acidic? Well, it's the place where there's more carbon dioxide, right? Where's carbon dioxide really high in concentration? At the body tissues, right? Where we're basically putting carbon dioxide from the body tissues into the bloodstream. So think about it. Why is this helpful? Why is it helpful where the acid, this acidic blood kicks off oxygen? Well, think about it. If hemoglobin is here, okay, hemoglobin's right there, and it's bound to a bunch of oxygen, right? So there's a bunch of O2 bound to the hemoglobin. But this effect says that it's getting acidic, right? There's a lot of carbon dioxide coming in. Therefore, oxygen is going to basically pop off of the hemoglobin and freely float in the blood. If it's freely floating in the blood, now it can move down its gradient, right? So since there's free-flowing oxygen and the partial pressure of oxygen is very high in the blood, low in the tissues, it's going to flow into the tissues. So it's beneficial because the more acidic, we're basically saying, hey, we're at the body tissues. Get that oxygen off of our hemoglobin so it can go into the tissues. It can't stay bound and feed the tissues. It's got to pop off of the hemoglobin and move into the body tissues. So that's really beneficial. On the flip side, the less acidic, so the higher the pH, the blood, the more hemoglobin will hold on to or bind oxygen. So think about that. Where is the blood less acidic? Well, it's where carbon dioxide isn't in the blood, or carbon dioxide is getting expelled from the blood. That happens at the lungs. What do we do at the lungs? We want to pull in oxygen and bind it on our hemoglobin. So, when the acid is very low, so high pH, up here, okay, we have less carbon dioxide, there's going to be more oxygen getting saturated onto our hemoglobin, right? So here, if you look at the hemoglobin, on these little blood cells, there will be a lot of oxygen bound to those hemoglobin. And that's good because then they're going to carry them down to the body tissues, drop them off the hemoglobin since it's more acidic, and it's going to flow into the body tissues. Okay? So that is a great example of all the law, Dalton's Law, the Bohr Effect, as well as the Haldane Effect, all going into positively affecting cell respiration of the body tissues, as well as overall respiration of the respiratory system. I think that is what I'm going to pause at, but I do want to talk a little bit about how we regulate blood pH, because at the beginning, I talked about how we regulate blood pH with our respiratory system, and one of the ways is moderating how much carbon dioxide is in the bloodstream, because the more carbon dioxide, obviously, the more hydrogen ions. So let me erase this for a bit. And I'm going to talk about how we moderate our acid level in our bloodstream. Well, in order to moderate anything, we need to receive information that it's changing, right? So there will be what's called chemoreceptors. Chemo meaning chemical, receptors obviously meaning receptors, in the aortic and carotid arches. Okay, these are your arteries, right? And there's going to be these receptors kind of testing the blood, and they will notice changes in pH. So for example, say you begin exercising, right? So if you're exercising, your body tissues are going to be using up a ton of oxygen, and they're going to be making a bunch of carbon dioxide. If they're making more carbon dioxide, your blood will become more acidic, right? So if pH drops, so it becomes more acidic, well, what will it do? Well, we're thinking about the respiratory system, your lungs, right? So if the chemoreceptors detect that the pH is super low, it's getting super acidic, it will stimulate deeper and faster breathing. Now, I want to be careful. The chemoreceptors themselves do not elicit this response. That is done by the medulla oblongata, so basically the base of your brainstem, which deals with autonomic responses. These chemoreceptors will basically notice this and stimulate it by stimulating or telling the medulla, or the medulla oblongata, which is part of your autonomic system. Things that happen naturally without you thinking about it. Okay, so think about it. When you start running or exercising, you don't have to actively think, oh, I need to breathe faster. Oh, I need to breathe faster. That's being done by the chemoreceptors telling this part of your brainstem, hey, you need to breathe faster because you've got a lot of carbon dioxide getting into your blood. We need to get it out. We also need to bring in more oxygen. However, actually, let me briefly talk about this. Since this will stimulate more breathing, this is a part of your sympathetic division of your autonomic nervous system. Okay, so your sympathetic nerve fibers hype you up for a fight or flight, basically, so it ramps you up to do something. However, if pH increases, so less acidic, so say you just get done with the run, okay? Your body tissues aren't making as much carbon dioxide, so your blood acidity, it gets less acidic, okay? Well, now you don't need to breathe as much. You don't need to expel as much carbon dioxide. So therefore, it will stimulate slower, less breathing, okay? And since we are basically slowing down our respiratory rate, we're calming down, this is a part of your parasympathetic division. Your parasympathetic says rest and digest and chill yourself out, okay? So those are the chemoreceptors. There are other regulators of breathing. For example, you have a pontine respiratory group, that's kind of the higher level, and it will stimulate two different regions of your brainstem to basically inspire slowly and then expire. Inspire and expire. We didn't talk about those as much in class, but just know that since your breathing happens without you thinking about it, it is done by the brainstem, which deals with those autonomic responses, those things that happen without you thinking about them, okay? But I also talked about how you can actively stimulate one of these to help yourself calm down or freak out, whichever one you want to do. So for example, if you want to stimulate your parasympathetic, so you want to calm down, what do? You take slow, deep breaths, right? It almost tricks your parasympathetic division to respond more to calm you down. However, if you have a panic attack, well, what happens? Well, you're overstimulated, you're stressed. So now you're breathing faster and faster and faster, right? And that can be dangerous too, because you could obviously change your blood acidity if you're hyperventilating and those types of things too. So that is a very long-winded explanation on the respiratory system, the Haldane effect, the Bohr effect, Dalton's Law, and how we move oxygen and carbon dioxide in and out of the blood. If you have any questions on any of these things, please let me know in the comment section. Like and subscribe if this was helpful, and I appreciate your time. Thank you for watching.